Imagine a world that feels too big to fail. A world where international trade routes span thousands of miles, where diplomats exchange letters between superpowers, ensuring peace and prosperity, where grand cities with heated floors and plumbing stand as monuments to human achievement. This sounds like our world today, but it is not. This was the reality of the Eastern Mediterranean over 3,000 years ago. It was a golden age of humanity, known to historians as the Late Bronze Age. But then, in the blink of an eye, the lights went out. Between the years 1200 and 1150 BC, almost every significant city in the known world was destroyed. It wasn't a slow decline. It was a sudden, violent, and absolute cataclysm. Palaces were burned to the ground. Trade routes were severed. Writing systems were forgotten. And entire civilizations, which had stood for centuries, vanished into the sand. For the survivors, it was effectively the end of the world. Humanity was plunged into a dark age that would last for centuries. History didn't just stumble, it stopped completely. To this day, scholars argue about what exactly pulled the trigger. Was it a climate shift? Was it a plague? Or was it the mysterious, terrifying force known only as the Sea Peoples? Welcome to the story of the apocalypse that actually happened. To understand the horror of the collapse, we first have to understand what was lost. 3,200 years ago, the world was surprisingly small and incredibly interconnected. This wasn't a time of isolated tribes hitting each other with rocks. It was an era of the G8 of antiquity. You had the mighty Egyptian Empire, ruling the Nile with immense wealth and stability. To the north, in what is now Turkey, lay the Hittite Empire, a military juggernaut that rivaled Egypt in power. In Greece, the Mycenaeans built massive fortresses and controlled the seas. And to the east, the Babylonians and Assyrians were masters of administration and law. These empires were not strangers to one another. We have found letters, actual clay tablets sent between kings that read like emails between modern heads of state. They called each other brother. They exchanged gifts of gold, lapis lazuli, and ivory. They married into each other's families to seal treaties. A merchant could load a ship in Egypt, sail to Cyprus for copper, trade in the ports of Canaan, and end up in Greece, all within a protected economic zone. It was a globalized economy, running on a delicate supply chain. And the most critical commodity in this chain was bronze. Bronze was the plastic, the steel, and the oil of the ancient world combined. It was used for tools, for weapons, for everything. But you cannot make bronze in one place. Bronze requires copper and tin. Copper was easy to find, mostly coming from the island of Cyprus, but tin was rare. It had to be imported from thousands of miles away, possibly as far as modern-day Afghanistan. This meant that no single nation was self-sufficient. The Mycenaeans needed the Hittites needed the Egyptians, and everyone needed the trade routes to stay open. This interdependence created a golden age of wealth, but it also created a fatal weakness. When you are part of a complex system, you are vulnerable to a system failure. If one domino falls, they all fall. And around 1177 BC, the first domino began to wobble. The collapse didn't start with an invasion. It likely started with the weather. Recent pollen analysis from ancient soil samples tells a terrifying story of climate change. Around this time, the region experienced a mega drought that lasted not for years, but for decades. In a world dependent on agriculture, no rain means no food, and no food means instability. We have records from the Hittite Empire pleading for grain shipments just to keep their people alive. One letter from a Hittite queen plainly states, "I have no grain in my lands." Imagine the desperation of a superpower having to beg for bread. As famine spread, the social contract began to break. People were starving. Rebellions started to flare up within the city walls. The internal structures of these great empires were weakening from the inside out. But then, while they were on their knees, something else arrived. Earthquakes. Archaeologists have found evidence of earthquake storms, a series of massive seismic events that rocked the region over a 50-year period. Cities that were already starving were now being leveled by the ground beneath them. Troy, Mycenae, and Ugarit all show signs of earthquake damage from this specific window of time. It feels like the universe was conspiring against the Bronze Age. Famine, drought, and seismic destruction all hitting at once. But humanity is resilient. We can rebuild after earthquakes. We can survive droughts. What we cannot survive is when the wolves come to the door while we are too weak to fight back. And that is exactly what happened. As the great empires crumbled under the weight of nature, a new threat appeared on the horizon. They came from the sea. They were a confederation of raiders, warriors, and desperate families moving en masse. History has given them a name that sounds almost ghostly: the Sea Peoples. We still do not know exactly who they were or where they came from. Some theories suggest they were refugees from Italy or Sicily. Others say they were Mycenaeans fleeing their own collapsing homeland. But to the people of the time, their origin didn't matter, only their arrival mattered. They were unlike any army the civilized world had ever seen. They didn't just want to conquer, they wanted to consume. They moved like a swarm of locusts, burning everything in their path. They brought their wives and children with them, suggesting this wasn't just a military campaign, it was a migration. A desperate, violent migration of people who perhaps were also running from the famine. But for the established cities, it was a death sentence. The most chilling evidence of their arrival comes from the city of Ugarit, a wealthy trading hub on the coast of modern-day Syria. Archaeologists found a clay tablet in the ruins of the city. It had been baked in the fires that destroyed the city, preserving it for 3,000 years. It was a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus, begging for help. The words are haunting. He wrote, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." He continues, "Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? The country is abandoned to itself." He ends with a desperate plea, "May my father know this. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." This letter was never sent. The city was sacked and burned before the messenger could leave the gates. Ugarit was not just captured, it was obliterated. The walls were toppled. The people were slaughtered or enslaved. The city was left as a smoking ruin, never to be inhabited again. And Ugarit was not alone. This was happening everywhere. The Hittite Empire, which had stood for hundreds of years, simply ceased to exist. Their capital, Hattusa, was burned. The royal family vanished. The Mycenaean civilization in Greece, the land of legends like Agamemnon and Achilles, fell into silence. Their grand palaces were destroyed. Their writing system, Linear B, was lost to time. It would be another 400 years before the Greeks learned how to write again. Think about that scale of loss. It is as if we forgot how to use the internet and electricity for 4 centuries. The wave of destruction moved south, relentless and unstoppable. It tore through Cyprus. It devastated Canaan. And finally, it set its sights on the last man standing, the prize of the ancient world, Egypt. The pharaoh Ramses III watched as the world around him burned. He saw the smoke rising from the north. He knew the swarm was coming for the Nile, and he knew that if Egypt fell, the light of civilization would be extinguished entirely. The Sea Peoples arrived at the delta of the Nile with a massive fleet. They had crushed every other army in their path. They had toppled the Hittites and the Mycenaeans. They seemed invincible. Ramses III rallied the last of his forces for a desperate stand. He lined the shores of the Nile with archers. He mobilized the Egyptian navy to trap the invaders in the river mouths. The resulting battle is carved onto the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. It depicts a chaotic, brutal struggle. Ships capsizing, warriors fighting in the water, captives being dragged away. It was a fight for survival, not just for Egypt, but for the very idea of order against chaos. But even though we have the carvings, the reality of what happened next is far more complex than a simple victory. Because while Ramses stopped the invasion, he couldn't stop the collapse. The world had already broken. The trade networks were dead. The tin had stopped flowing. The bronze could no longer be made. The complex, globalized economy that had sustained millions of people for centuries had evaporated. Egypt survived the battle, but it was a hollow victory. The empire was bankrupt. The pharaoh's power waned, and the region slid into a long, dark winter of history. This is the terrifying reality of the Bronze Age collapse. It serves as a grim reminder. Civilizations do not always move forward. Progress is not guaranteed. We like to think that we are too advanced to fail, that our technology and our global networks make us immune to the kind of disaster that befell the ancients. But the people of Ugarit thought the same thing. The merchants of the Hittite Empire thought the same thing. They believed their walls were high enough and their gods were strong enough, until the day the ships appeared on the horizon. But who were these sea peoples, really? And what happened to the survivors in the centuries of darkness that followed? The answers might be even more disturbing than the collapse itself. The dust settles on the banks of the Nile. Ramses III saved Egypt, but the victory was bitter. He looked out at a world that had gone quiet. The trade ships stopped arriving, and the horizon remained empty. The real horror of the apocalypse wasn't the fire, it was the silence that followed. Historians call this the Greek Dark Ages. For 400 years, history effectively went blank. The population plummeted, and the grand stone palaces were abandoned to the weeds. But the most chilling loss was memory. Writing was completely forgotten. Grandfathers told stories of a golden age of heroes, which eventually mutated into myths like the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were distorted memories of a real past that was now dead. But who were the destroyers? We now believe the Sea Peoples were not just mindless barbarians. They were refugees. Displaced by the drought and earthquakes, they were victims who became victimizers in a desperate bid to survive. One group, the Peliset, eventually settled in the Holy Land. History knows them by a different name, the Philistines. The villains of the Bible were actually the desperate survivors of the Bronze Age collapse. Yet, this destruction forced a breakthrough. With the trade routes cut, there was no tin to make bronze. Blacksmiths were forced to experiment with a harder, uglier metal found in the dirt, iron. The collapse of the old world is exactly what pushed humanity into the Iron Age. Out of the ashes, new civilizations rose, but the lesson remains. Civilization is a thin veneer over a chaotic reality. The apocalypse has happened before, and the ruins of the past stand as a silent warning. Thank you for joining us. If you have a thirst for knowledge and the unknown, make sure to subscribe to Felix Files. We will see you in the shadows next time.